welcome to our Lotus Centre virtual workshop. Today's workshop is all about building gross motor skills with occupational therapy and how that can be used in combination with what we're doing in music lessons to help build gross motor skills in our music students. So my name is Olivia Adams and I'm the Director of Education here at the Lotus Centre. Just a couple of quick disclaimers before I introduce Nikki, who will be leading our workshop today. We pre-recorded it so that we could include exercises that you're going to see in the second half of the workshop, but because of a glitch in the audio that I didn't notice until after the fact, I couldn't use the high quality audio and had to use the computer audio. So there are parts where you can really hear some background noise, and I apologize for the audio quality there. Additionally, you'll see a couple of thumbs up reactions pop up on the screen, and that is because the recording software that I use has a feature that I didn't know existed, and that feature is that it tries to read your reaction and then give an emoji to match that reaction. And so again, I didn't notice this until after the fact when I went to put the video together. And so there are a few times when the camera reads our reactions as thumbs up. So there are some distracting bubbles that pop across the screen, and I apologize, but I hope they give you a little giggle when they appear. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce our guest clinician, Nicole Lemire. Nicole Lemire, aka Nikki, is an occupational therapist and author of the children's book, A Birthday Party for Mo. She currently works at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, providing school and home-based occupational therapy services. Nikki has worked as an occupational therapist for 7 years in both public and private funded sectors. As a person with many interests and hobbies herself, Nikki is passionate about supporting all people, but especially children, in participating and engaging in meaningful activities. Nikki holds a Bachelor of Biological Sciences from the University of Alberta's campus Saint Jean and a Master of Health Sciences in Occupational Therapy from the University of Ottawa. As a lifelong learner, Nikki has attended a multitude of workshops and conferences. These range from a multi-day advanced training with STAR Institute for sensory processing to a weekend of mentorship with renowned Canadian occupational therapist Kim Barthel, to a 25-hour Vinyasa yoga for youth teacher training, and a workshop on the use of sound in sensory motor integrative treatment. Nikki works and plays in Ottawa, where she lives with her partner Ollie, their dog Leo, and their cat Lilu. When not performing her duties as an occupational therapist, she can be found exploring the city and its surrounding areas, playing Disney music on her violin, baking sourdough bread, rock climbing, or playing volleyball. Welcome, Nikki. Hi, Nikki.
Hello.
It's so good to have you here today, giving us a workshop webinar on how occupational therapy can combine with music.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
So I have prepared a few questions for you.
Okay.
And I wondered if we could start with, how do you see occupational therapy working with what we do as musicians and music teachers as practitioners?
Sure. Can I start by just explaining what I think occupational therapy is in general?
Please.
think it's often something that can be hard to define, and everyone has experienced, well, not everyone, but when people experience occupational therapists, we work in a lot of different settings. So when we talk about occupation, it's really anything that occupies your time. So our profession, occupational therapists, our job is to help people occupy their time in a way that's meaningful for them, and to help people do all the things that they need or want to do. And so in this case, it would be music. And so there are, different people who might have challenges learning music the way most of us do. And so I think an occupational therapist could be helpful in breaking down some of those tasks, identifying adaptations that could be made to the environment to make it easier for someone to learn music, or adaptations that could be made to the task of learning itself, or ideas of how to build certain skills so that a child might be more ready to learn.
Mm-hmm. How do you see, beyond the adaptations in the environment, how do you see occupational therapy helping us with, we're going to be talking about gross motor skills, and then later on we'll do a workshop on fine motor skills, but how do you see it occupational therapy combining with the gross motor skills that we use in music?
Right, so I think that would be an OT really doing kind of a task analysis of what is the instrument that's being played and what are the gross motor skills involved, and then how can we develop those. A little secret is most gross motor skills require some sort of like core stability, so that's probably the root or the core, if you will,
Yeah.
of all the recommendations we're going to be making. So that's kind of what I would say there.
So that's sort of the foundation is the core. So today we're talking about gross motor skills, and can you introduce what is, so beyond the core, what is sort of our growth system, and what are we talking about when we're saying gross motor skills?
Sure. So I think of gross motor skills as when we're using kind of the big muscles of our body to do big movements, things like walking or like sitting, jumping, swimming. So those are examples outside of music. And then I think you probably have some good ideas of what they would be in the music realm.
Yeah, I can think of it like holding ourselves up. I'm a pianist, so holding ourselves up at a piano is really a skill that I have realized the more young students I teach, that that's a skill that has to be developed.
Yeah.
And the ability to sit up straight and then use your limbs to do something different than, hold you up, because a lot of them want to sit like this.
For sure. And so I can imagine there's that core stability that is kind of what our arms are being anchored into. And so if we don't have that core stability, it's kind of like trying to write without anchoring your hand on a table. So if you don't have anything strong to anchor into, your arms are going to be much more wiggly. So I think also like shoulder joint stability, wrist stability, and then as we start to get in the hands, we're talking a bit more about fine motor, but those are kind of the muscles that we would want to make sure are strong and stable and coordinated.
What about like at work for singing and playing wind instruments or brass instruments? Does that have to anything with our gross motor skills?
Totally. So, and this is something I've learned from working with physiotherapists who are also great to pull into this discussion if you have a chance. But my understanding is we have kind of external core muscles and then internal core muscles. And our internal core muscles are really the ones that are responsible for our posture and our breathing. So it's really the muscles that includes like our pelvic floor and our diaphragm, which is right beneath our lungs. And so those are the ones that really need to be activated in order to support our posture. And one of the best ways to actually strengthen them is doing breath work and learning to be able to kind of use that diaphragm and breathe fully. So there's different activities that I know a lot of pediatric physios will actually do that involve breathing or blowing bubbles while also doing movements like laying on your back and lifting up your hips. Even things like humming are going to get you doing some of that breath work. So that would tie in really nicely with, I'm sure, a lot of things that you're doing with your students.
I mean, some of the other things that use our gross motor skills, we can think of guitar strumming, we can think of playing the drums where we're balancing what we're doing with our feet and our limbs. And that's something that's super tricky. Conducting, you're a violinist playing the violin, or any string instrument for that matter, you have to support the string instrument and then also do something with your other
Sure. When I played the violin, I realized just like where are the weaknesses in my core and my posture. Often you play it in standing. Yeah, there's a strength that goes into it. And it's funny, like it's actually a lot harder to hold some of the static movements. If you think of, if you've ever tried doing yoga, sometimes it's those poses that you have to hold that are actually more difficult than the ones that you're moving in and out of. So that's where you might find a lot of your kids are very wiggly when they're trying to learn, because it's actually hard for them to hold themselves up straight.
That's really interesting. And when you were showing like how your shoulders and the connection, and you want the stability in your core, or else your limbs are going to be sort of moving up here. That's something I talk with young students about a lot. Their shoulders end up kissing their, we always say they're kissing their ears, right? when they're learning to play the notes. So getting them to like relax and to breathe while they're playing their instrument is something that I'm thinking about a lot. And so now I'm realizing that's part of the gross motor skills.
Totally.
As a string player, can you give us any sort of feedback or tips as a string player and also an occupational therapist on how we can sort of build up our students' strength to hold their instrument? So I'm thinking of, a trumpet, they have to hold it up here, or a clarinet, they're holding it in front, a flute, they're holding it to their side, the strings, they're either going between their legs, or they'll start with a violin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then they're having to hold it for long periods of time, and oftentimes they get really tired.
Mm-hmm.
Are there things that we can do as music instructors to sort of help build those and strengthen those muscles?
So in thinking about that, again, I'm thinking of the core and the shoulders. And my favorite activities for building that are actually anything that has to do with crawling. So we might need to use some of your creativity to see how to fit that in with music, but anything that you are like army crawling or crawling like a cat or a dog and all fours, what you're doing there is getting a lot of weight in through your shoulders to build the stability there, and you're kind of in a plank position, which is building your core, but we want to add the breathing into that. We don't want them doing that while holding their breath, and so maybe you're incorporating some singing or some humming or something like that. So that's kind of my go-to when it comes to really shoulders and core. And it's funny because that's actually something that all children typically go through as they're developing, is that crawling stage. And so many parents are in a hurry to move their kid along to see them walking, but actually when they're crawling, they're building so much, so many skills, not just the strength, but also the bilateral coordination of figuring out how to put one hand in front of the other and to coordinate like the arms and then the legs and have them going like alternating.
So interesting. We'll have to think about activities that can incorporate the crawling.
Yeah, I mean, I'm somebody who's always going with different animals and things like that, but I mean, in general, movement and music goes well together, so I don't know, even if it's like a little warm-up of kind of like a freestance kind of warm-up or something like that, or can you step on the beat and like pause and things like that, so I'm sure you'll come up with something.
So keeping rhythm
Yeah.
is also sort of incorporating into that gross motor skills. So can you talk about the role of the gross motor coordination and preparation in our ability ourselves, our instruments, support it? So we're talking about we just finished talking about the building. How can we teach the coordination part of it, do you think?
Okay. So are we talking more about like the bilateral coordination?
Yeah, I think so.
Those hands together. So there's a few different activities that I tend to do. Things like juggling with scarves, or there's one activity. It's called Bal-a-vis-x, I think is how you would say it. It's an acronym, a strange acronym. It stands for balance, auditory, visual exercises.
Okay.
So I mean, it's incorporating rhythm, and the idea is you have. I mean, we can do a demonstration at some point, but you have a beanbag in each hand and you're kind of tossing it over and then giving it to a partner and you're trying to keep rhythm. And so it's really that crossing of the midline that can be really key with that. So there's some kids who really struggle with crossing midline, and you might even see them writing and with one hand and they get to the middle and they switch their hand and write with the other hand. I imagine that makes it difficult with piano and
Definitely
stuff like
happens
that.
in piano.
Right. So there's different activities like really that like handing one thing from one hand to the other, scarf, throwing it up with one hand, catching it with the other, or throwing it up with one hand and then like touching your shoulder and catching it. I like to use scarves because it gives you like a hang time to catch it. So that's a couple activities that I like to do. But even doing like kind of some yoga stretches ahead of time where maybe you're standing up and then you're bending over and touching the opposite foot, standing back up. Some things like that where you're just getting your body, your arms really crossing midline, touching different parts of your body. It's also building body awareness when we do some of those things, and helping with, we call it proprioception, your ability to tell where your body is in space. Which actually, now that I think about it, applies so much to musical instruments.
It really does.
I think of when I'm playing my violin, which I'm not very good at it. I'm just getting back into it. But I notice that when I'm really concentrating on trying to read the music, all of a sudden it's like I forget where my arms are, and then it like derails off the string and starts to get squeaky. So really having that awareness of where your body is in space without having to look is so key to be able to play, to actually look at the music and know where your hands are. So doing activities like yoga, especially if you kind of do it like with your eyes closed sometimes, or any activity where you're really, like touching your shoulder with your eyes closed or while looking elsewhere, is helping to build that awareness. Also, a lot of activities that involve like deep pressure. So getting massages, playing with a vibrating massager, a lot of the animal walks that I was kind of just talking about to build your core. It's also building that body awareness, playing kind of more that rough and tumble play, which is probably more for home than in the classroom. but some kids really love to, sit on a nice comfy couch and then have some pillows squished into them, that sort of thing. It's all building those connections between their brain and their muscles to understand where they are in space, so that it's a little bit easier for them to not have to keep track of their hands so conscientiously when they're playing their music.
Really interesting. And the idea of deep pressure, I can think of a couple of students who like rhythm by squeezing their arms or by squeezing their legs as part of when we're practicing our rhythms. And so that is also sort of building that body
So
awareness.
I am convinced that there is connection between like proprioception and our vestibular system and our auditory system. I'm pretty sure there's also research to support it, but
talk about those systems.
Sure. Okay. So proprioception is what we just talked about. Inside of our joints, inside of our muscles, there are little receptors that are sending information to our brain saying where we are in space. So I can close my eyes and hopefully touch my nose. Whew, I did it. So that is your proprioceptive system. Your auditory system is really your ears. So that's literally the sound waves that come in, that go into our ears, and I don't exactly know what happens, but somehow it gets turned into an electrical system, our signal that goes to our brain, and we're like, oh, I know that song, or I understand that word. And then we have our vestibular system, which also involves our inner ear. And there's definitely a connection between vestibular system and auditory system, because it's even some of the same organs, but it's actually these like semicircular canals inside of our ears that are filled with fluid. And when that fluid moves around, it tells our brain how we're moving in space, if we're rocking side to side, if we're going forward and back, if we're jumping up and down, that sort of thing. So I think that's why music makes us dance. There's something about hearing that's activating that movement system. And then I'm convinced, like when I hear a good drum beat, I want to like jump. To me, it screams proprioception. And there's actually a lot of therapists, like occupational therapists and physiotherapists, who will use things like metronome or certain music, like therapeutic sounds and songs, to help with movement disorders and things like that. So it's a really cool realm of learning and research that I get excited about. But yeah.
So then all of those systems are integrating.
Exactly, and yeah, they can support one another, I guess. So it makes sense to me that some people, to really understand the rhythm, they need to like squeeze their arms. They need to feel the rhythm, or like when you're by a speaker and you feel it like resonating in your body. I remember as a kid, the first time I was listening to music that was too loud, there was something just like amazing about it because I could feel it in my body.
It's like visceral.
Exactly. Yeah. It's so cool.
And now thinking about that, I definitely, even just today, I was teaching a lesson where we were practicing the rhythm and we were tapping it on our legs. So using that sort of kinesthetic connection. And the kid was sort of pulsing with their whole body to be able to feel where that beat was. And so it's definitely like you said, when we hear a good drum beat, we want to dance, or we want to tap our toe, or we want to move. There's
something very
that connection,
primal about it. And you think of even the way we rock babies and sing, you know, nursery rhymes and things like that. Like it's developing the system and it's making these connections, and it's our sensory system that's getting developed. And if we don't have a good sensory system, if we're not receiving accurate information through all of these sensory receptors, it's really hard for us to make a motor output that is coherent. So I think there's also something to be said about, you know, we have to learn and listen to music probably before we can produce it, I would say, you know, it's that receiving the sensory information, and then we can go and make a motor response.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm wondering if you can speak to, I'm going to be selfish here and talk about piano.
Okay.
But as a pianist and as a teacher, oftentimes, you know, we're taught like we need to have the kid sitting on the bench for 30 minutes or 45 minutes. But I find with my students that is a really long time. And so I like to break it up between getting up off the bench and then going back on the bench, and sort of integrating some of these, like we'll do music listening activities, or a kinesthetic, like movement-based activity in coordination with music, or just get up and move and give ourselves a little bit of a body break. I was wondering, can you speak to that in terms of how does sitting affect students? You work with students sometimes in schools. How does that sort of affect, if they're sitting all day, how does that affect sort of their gross motor skills and coordination?
Sure. Well, I mean, I kind of think it goes back to what we just said, where you have so many students that you're realizing are very wiggly. And part of that probably is that their core isn't strong enough to be able to sit for 30 minutes. Like imagine if you had to hold a plank or hold any yoga pose for 30 minutes, right?
I couldn't do it.
Exactly. So I think it probably feels a bit like that to them. But also there are just some of us who, especially for kiddos, they're wired to be seeking out sensory experiences in order to build their nervous system. So especially for a younger kid, it might be that that's the same sensory experience for too long, and we need to break it up to, you know, re-engage them. And I think just some of us are more movement seekers, and so having a little break, and especially to practice something that's still like very rhythmical based or bilaterally based, I think that actually would bring so much benefit back if you know, split it up that way.
Yeah, that's really great to know. And thinking about it as like if we were practicing a yoga pose and had to hold it for 30 minutes, that's how a young child feels when they have to sit for that long without any sort of movement. Oftentimes, you know, we'll be like, oh, like no wiggles or no jellyfish at the piano. I definitely used to say that. I'm totally guilty of that when I was first teaching, thinking that they just maybe didn't have the attention span. But really, it's that urge to move and get out of that position to find a new position.
Exactly. And even if they don't have the attention span, like, well, mixing it up probably will make it more engaging to come back. And I think every child is different. There's probably some who would be so excited to sit for 30 minutes and can get lost in it, but their nervous system is ready for that. Whereas a child who's not sitting, you know, like, I forget who it was, but there's a saying that kind of runs around in the OT community that like children will you know, do if they can, right? Like they'll succeed and behave, if you will, when it's even possible for them. So kind of seeing their behavior as communication of like, this is really hard for me, and maybe they still want to on some level, but there's some other piece, some part of them that just like not able to sit for that long.
Oh, that's great. Well, let's talk about singing for a moment, because it's a skill in which our instrument is our bodies. It's ourselves, right? So there's a lot of breath control that is required. Can you speak to the role that our lungs and our breathing are playing into those gross motor skills?
Sure. So again, it's actually muscles that are responsible for our breath work, and that is that inner core, the inner core muscles, and that includes like our pelvic floor, our diaphragm. Apparently, those two things mirror each other in the ways that they move, which I thought was cool when I learned that. And so it is also like a muscle that needs to be developed, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think you probably know this even better than me as someone who does sing and has had to learn to do that breath control. I've always used that more in my setting as a therapeutic modality because I'll use singing and humming and blowing to help strengthen those muscles. And I'll also use it to support regulation because when we are having long exhalations, it actually helps calm our nervous system. And that's, again, I always refer to yoga, but it's what helps us calm down in yoga when we have to do those long exhalations. That's to bring our nervous system down. And then when we do short, like in and outs, that's to kind of like arouse it and get us more excited, if you will. So it's interesting because I've always used that more for my other purposes, but now you're asking, okay, like what are the core strength things we can do, the inner core strength things we can do to support breath work. So I think, I mean, other than just singing and blowing bubbles, humming, any sort of blowing activity, blowing little windmills or blowing a pom-pom ball across the table. Some people will make these little, they almost look like little mini soccer fields, and they'll have a straw and they're trying to blow the ping pong ball into the other person's court, and then you can play against someone. So those are things that, like, if someone's really into singing and they want some breath work exercises they could do at home or fun games that they could do with a parent at home, it might be some things like that.
Those are all great activities. So if you're a singing teacher, choir teacher, those are activities that can be incorporated, and even just as a bit of a body break to break up the standing and singing with some movement, with some play.
I love it.
All right, so fun. So I think now it would be great if you could show us some occupational therapy exercises that we can maybe then think about incorporating into music lessons. Are you good with that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Awesome.
I'm going to show kind of the more basic versions of some of these activities, and then once people are familiar with them, there's always ways you can make them more complicated, and you can find ideas like on YouTube and online. But we'll start with some basic Bal-a-vis-x, so that's the balance, auditory, visual exercises.
Okay.
We're going to use some bean bags. These I think were like handmade by someone.
They're beautiful.
Yeah, it's just, I don't even know what's in them. It might be rice, to be honest. It might be a rice bag. But you're going to have one in that hand.
Okay.
I'm going to have one in this hand. And we could have like a metronome on if we wanted, or some music with a bit of a beat or something like that. But basically, you're going to kind of copy what I do. So we're going to go across and then like this. Yes. And we're going to go. Perfect. So we're kind of getting, like, this is building that bilateral coordination, that rhythm. We're crossing the midline. We're starting to get a sense of where our body is in space. So that proprioception piece. And so now we can stop and try and go the other way. So, we're confused, and that's good. That means we're growing. All right. So I'm going to give this to you. You're going to give this to me. Here we go. So here we go. This is good. Keep going.
Wow.
Keep going.
Okay.
Yeah, you're getting it.
This is really working my brain.
Well, and that's what it's meant to do. Apparently this was developed by like a teacher who noticed a lot of it. I think he might have been a gym teacher, and he noticed a lot of his students were having trouble with attention. And he developed this activity to kind of support them with that. So when you ask the question, like some of my kiddos, maybe it's just that they don't have the attention. This might be a good way to get them back in focus. So we can step it up a notch.
All right.
Yes, give me that one. Okay. So now we're going to go behind, back, hand, and then we're going to give it to each other, I think. Now we're going to cross.
Oh, and then we cross.
Yeah,
okay.
I might be confusing us. And then back. And then behind our backs. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to find a rhythm in this somehow. Cross, and then behind our backs, and then here we go. And then cross. And then behind our backs, and then here we go. And then cross, and then behind our backs, and then here we go. Whew. We
This
could
is a
go
great
the
workout.
other direction. Do you think we're capable of figuring that out?
I think we can do
Okay,
it.
so now I think I give this to you. We go
Okay.
behind our backs, and then we cross.
Cross.
And I don't know, is this right? I think
Behind
so.
our backs, and then
So there are
give,
people who are much
cross.
more competent with this online. I haven't actually practiced this one in a little while. I pulled it out of the recesses of my brain for this activity. So we're messing it up, which is okay. You can have fun with it. This is also a great time to practice growth mindset. That's actually something worth thinking about with those kiddos who get so frustrated when they can't do it. If you're experiencing some of those, when you're messing up, it means you're on your like just right challenge, right? Like if we weren't messing this up, then why bother doing it? Like we should be doing things that are difficult for us so that we're actually growing.
We talk about in education the zone of proximal development.
Yeah. OTs are all about that. We always want everything to be the just right challenge is our big phrase. So, okay, we can now move on. We've graduated-ish from these, and we're going to use some racquetballs to do something similar. They'll be a little bit more chaotic, so choose wisely what students you do them with, but they're really fun. So this is another Bal-a-vis-x activity, but this time we're using a racquetball. So it has some nice bounce to it, and it'll be a partnered activity again. So if you could, yes, perfect. So similarly, we're going to pass the ball to ourselves, and then we're going to kind of underhand release. It's going to bounce on the ground. You're going to catch it same side hand, and then pass it over to yourself, bounce it to me. So over to myself, bounce. Perfect. And again, you could have like a metronome on, practice some beat, you could have some music going. Perfect. We'll switch directions, see if we're ready. Nice. Pretty good. I think we've graduated. We're gonna add a second ball. So now it's more like the beanbag activity. So we're starting opposite hands. Passing to ourselves, releasing. Ooh, that was perfect timing. We are in sync. And there are versions of this activity where you're just one person doing activities like bouncing the ball up and down to yourself, having two balls. So you can find all kinds of ways to progress this online. Perfect. We were in our Just Right challenge, making mistakes. That's good. But yeah, you can find different ways to progress this activity online. YouTube is full of all kinds of great different activities. So if you had someone who was a bit distractible, they could kind of go maybe do a couple activities with the ball by themselves. You might be preparing something for the next part of the lesson, and then they can come back having gotten their wiggles out a bit and yeah.
The other thing I thought about when we were using these balls is that it would be great for students that are doing a duet and need to learn to play together and keep beat together.
Yeah.
To be just seeing if they can get in sync with each other, and even if you as the teacher can do something like playing the piano to keep a steady beat.
That's really cool.
And helping them to sort of coordinate so that they're counting and moving in sync with each other. All right, Nikki, what are we going to do with these scarves?
So I am stealing this idea from a physiotherapist who posted some videos on YouTube. We can add a link because she has all kinds of great variations of this. But I like using scarves for practicing hand-eye coordination because they float. So it gives you more time to coordinate your hand to go and actually grab the scarf. So for a younger kid, it could be as simple as trying to get them to pass the scarf from one hand to another. So just kind of throwing it up, trying to keep it in the air. You could do this with a balloon too. If you don't have a scarf, I've heard some people do it with like plastic bags, or maybe you could use tissue paper. I don't really know. So this is like one version of it. I think, yeah, there's all different things you could pass it back and forth. But if we want to really up the ante and focus on that crossing midline bilateral coordination, you could have where you're throwing it up, touching your shoulder, catching it. Throwing it up, opposite shoulder, catch it. Perfect. And then we might move on to our knee and catch it. Knee, catch it. Perfect. And then we might do our foot, if you can lift your foot up and catch it. And then we got some balance going.
Whoa.
And then you might go ahead and do it with the other arm now. Crossing, throwing it up and catching it. Then going down to your knee and catching it a few times. Then we'll try our foot. Perfect. So this could be, a nice way to work on some of those gross motor skills.
For sure. I've often done that activity with the sensory scarves set to music. So I'll choose music that has a slow beat that I think that they can feel, and then we'll toss, and we'll do the toss touch.
Oh, very cool. I like it.
So that, because in piano, they have to cross their hands quite a bit. So this is wonderful to set to music as well.
Very cool. Okay, so now we're going to try some animal walks. These are some of my favorite things to do, and they're great for building core and for building gross motor coordination. So my first animal, I like to call this one a snail because you're moving very slowly. And the way it works is you sit down on your bottom. It can be pretty tricky for some kids, and they might need a little bit of support at their hips to learn the movement. But what you're doing is really lifting up one hip and shifting it forward, and then lifting up the other hip and shifting it forward. So you're taking really tiny little steps with your butt. Sometimes they tell little kiddos to pretend they're lifting up their butt cheek for a little toot, and then they'll fart on the other side, and they think that's hilarious. So that's one way to do it as well. You can also do it backwards. Some people find it easier to go backwards than forwards. But this is a nice one because you can do it in a pretty small space as well. So that's snail. Another one that I really enjoy, and this is usually pretty accessible for most kids, is a lizard, which is also just an army crawl. What we want to see there is really that bilateral coordination where the opposite arm, opposite leg are moving together, and you're just keeping your belly on the ground, moving your legs. Maybe I can do it from another angle as well. So you're just doing a bit of an army crawl, and that's the lizard. Another one I like to do that's a bit trickier is the fish. So you're on your belly, you're lifting up your shoulders, that's really strengthening the back, good for our posture, and then you're scooting your hip up, and then your other hip. And it's a very small movement. Sometimes I say it's a fish out of water that's trying to get back to the sea. So this can be a good one to do as well. And it doesn't take up that much space. A good one for strengthening the shoulders is donkey kicks. Sometimes I'll even put a little picture of the hands on the floor or the feet on the floor so they have something to aim. You could just put tape. But they're keeping their hands glued to the floor, and then they're gently kicking up like this. So that's a really good one for building the shoulders, which is so important for holding up our instruments, as we discussed. So another animal walk you can do is not so much a walk, but it's a hedgehog who rolls into a little ball. So you can start on your back like this, and then you bring your knees into your chest. You lift up your head, that's key. A lot of kids want to just leave it down there. Lift up your head and your shoulders and grab your knees. And then I like to say the hedgehog is scared, so he lets out a little cry and he goes, and that just makes sure that we're not holding our breath as we do our hedgehog, and then you can relax. So you could do that one a couple times just to really strengthen those inner core muscles that we talked about.
And that is our workshop on building gross motor skills. I hope that this proves helpful in your teaching, and we would love to hear from you if it does. You can find some helpful links below on some of the items that we referenced in the workshop. Nikki will be joining us in the new year on a workshop on building fine motor skills. So keep an eye out for that link when it launches. Thanks so much for engaging with the Lotus Centre. You can find more information about our programs at thelotuscentre.net and more professional development opportunities, including future webinars and our current courses that are running through the Lotus Centre Institute for Professional Development at institute.lotuscentre.net. Happy teaching!